News of the Times. The William Horry case. The murder that changed British executions in 1872. Today, we're stepping into one of the most significant turning points in British criminal history. A case that didn't just shock a community, but permanently reshaped how Britain carried out the death penalty. In March 1872, a troubled husband named William Horry walked into the quiet lodgings where his estranged wife Jane was living, and moments later, a single gunshot shattered the hallway. What unfolded would become the test case for Britain's brand new long drop execution method, a moment when Victorian justice tried to redefine itself as modern, scientific, and in its own way, more humane. In this episode, we will explore the marriage breakdown and the threats that led to the killing, the forensic and eyewitness evidence that left the jury little room for doubt, and how executioner William Marwood debuted his long drop and changed the gallows forever. What the public, the press, and even fellow executioners thought of this new method, and why this case still marks the moment British executions stepped into a new era. This is a story of domestic tragedy, legal transformation, and a single invention that altered more than a century of British justice. Our further particular story introduces a publican who draws the line, not at drunkenness or brawling, but at lady cyclists wearing rational dress. Yes, Victorian Britain was brought to its knees by knickerbockers. So settle back, ideally under a blanket, weather permitting of course, with a mug of something appropriately warming. We're heading into 1872, where emotions run high, tempers run short, and the execution method is about to get a very brisk redesign. The marriage of William and Jane Horry. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in 1872, we must begin several years earlier, with a marriage that promised prosperity but unravelled with alarming speed. William Horry first met his future wife, Jane Wright, in Burslem in Staffordshire. Jane was then working as a barmaid, first at the George Hotel under Mr. Charles Blake, and briefly at the Sneyd Arms in Tunstall. She was the daughter of respectable Northamptonshire parents, steady, capable, and well liked. William was employed at the brewery of Mr. Parker, and the young couple quickly formed an attachment. They married soon after Jane left her position at the Sneyd Arms. William's father, a man of means and influence in Boston in Lincolnshire, wished to give the newlyweds a strong start. He purchased the George Hotel for them outright, paying an incoming valuation of £800, a remarkable sum, equivalent to roughly £120,000 today. With that investment, William and Jane appeared set for a solid future, a thriving business, a growing reputation, and soon a family of 3 small children. For a time, the marriage was a happy one, but then the cracks began. William developed increasingly dissolute habits, heavy drinking, erratic temper, and bouts of paranoia. He became fixated on the idea that Jane was unfaithful despite the complete lack of evidence. His accusations grew louder and more frequent, even as friends, employers, and relatives dismissed them as the product of drink and unstable jealousy. By the spring of 1871, William's drinking had reached the point where the business could no longer be properly managed. The George Hotel was given up. Jane, weary and frightened, left with the children to stay with her brother in Northampton. William's father, seeing clearly where the fault lay, took Jane's side. Convinced that his son's accusations were unfounded, he invited his daughter-in-law and grandchildren to live with him in Boston. It was a striking household arrangement for the time. The estranged wife welcomed the biological son, kept at a distance. William did visit occasionally, but the situation deteriorated quickly. His behaviour grew even more erratic and aggressive. He arrived drunk, made scenes, and terrified the children. Eventually, the elder Mr. Horry issued a firm ultimatum. William was not to return until he could reform his conduct. He did not reform. By the late 1871, William had lost his business, his home, access to his children, and even his father's support. Worse still, he served a short prison sentence for failing to pay the court-ordered maintenance for his family. Now living in Nottingham, disgraced and spiralling, William made one final attempt to reclaim what he believed was his rightful place. He travelled uninvited and unwelcome to his father's home, where Jane was staying, and pleaded for a reconciliation. Jane refused. She refused firmly, and his father would not allow him to see her, showing his son out of the house. But William Horry, already drowning in drink, resentment, and wounded pride, that refusal became the turning point. Within days, their story would end not in reconciliation, but in a murder that changed the course of British execution history forever. From the Lincolnshire Free Press, the 23rd of January 1872, the shocking tragedy at Boston. As we briefly stated in our last impression, the town of Boston on Monday week was thrown into the wildest state of consternation from the currency of a report that a young man named Horry, was very respectably connected, had shot his wife. Unfortunately, the rumour proved to be too well founded, and much sympathy is expressed on all sides for the families who have, by their shocking act, been thrown into a state of the utmost misery. It appears from information gleaned from the newspaper reports that the murderer was brought up at Boston, where his father kept the Red Cow, the house at which the inquest was held. But for several years past, Mr. Horry Sr. had carried on an extensive business as a brewer. Young Horry removed to Burslem some years ago, and there first met Miss Wright, his future wife, who was at that time a barmaid at the George Hotel, then kept by Mr. Charles Blake. Horry himself filled an appointment at the brewery of Mr. Parker. Miss Wright afterwards went in a similar capacity to the Sneyd Arms Hotel in Tunstall, where she remained but a short time, and immediately after leaving was married to Horry. Miss Wright was the daughter of respectable parents at Northampton, and after her marriage to the prisoner, Mr. Horry Sr. set up his son in the George Hotel at Burslem, paying, it is said, £800 as the ingoing valuation, value approximately £120,000 in 2026. The young couple lived happily until the husband gave way to dissolute habits. Business was neglected, and eventually, after the spring of last year, The hotel was given up, and the wife with 3 young children went to live with her brother at Northampton. Before then, allegations had been made by the prisoner of his wife's faithfulness, but his accusations were found to be without any foundation. So satisfied with Mr. Horry Sr. of the untruthfulness of his son's stories that he took the young wife and children to live with him at Boston. The prisoner visited them occasionally, but he seems to have given himself up to a life of dissipation, and at length his father refused to have him at home again unless there was some reformation in his conduct. Groundless as the charge of the wife's infidelities were, her husband had for a long time been openly leading a most immoral life. Some months ago he went to Nottingham and made himself very conspicuous in fast society. It was well known that much of his time was passed among the demi-monde, and without any false delicacy about the matter, it may be stated that he resided chiefly at a notorious house in Horton Street. The news of Jane Horry's death rippled through Boston with a shock that few could fully absorb. The Horry name was well known in the district, respected, long-standing, and associated with steadiness and generosity. Jane herself had been embraced as a true daughter by William's parents, treated with warmth and sincerity, even as their own son drifted beyond their reach. To learn then that William had taken her life and done so in the very house where she and the children had been given refuge was almost beyond belief. Sympathy flowed immediately and overwhelmingly toward Mr. and Mrs. Horry, who now faced not only the loss of their daughter-in-law, but the far more agonising truth that their own son had created this devastation within their home. The inquest was convened at once, and in a detail that struck many as painfully symbolic. The proceedings were held in the inn owned by Mr. Horry Sr. A respected establishment became, for one grim afternoon, the setting in which the family's private tragedy was laid bare for official examination. It was there, amid familiar walls and familiar faces, that the formal investigation into Jane's death began, an inquest that would confirm the community's worst fears and set Britain on a course towards one of the most consequential executions in its history. Inquest. Betsy Wingate deposed, I am the housemaid in the family of Mr. Horry, the deceased. Jane Horry has lived with us nearly a year. Her husband did not live with us. He came over occasionally and was last here before Sunday night, about 10 weeks ago. I did not see him on Sunday night, but I saw him on Monday morning. There was nothing unusual in his manner. He was about the house all the morning. About 10 minutes to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I heard the report of a pistol. I was in the kitchen at the time, and my impression was that the pistol was fired in the front passage. On getting there, I saw the deceased fall onto the floor of the breakfast room, only a few steps from the door. I did not hear her say anything. No one was present at that time but my mistress and myself. I ran into the yard to fetch in the brewer. When I returned about 3 minutes afterwards, my mistress said the deceased was dead. Her husband was standing at her feet, holding a pistol in his hand. He said, I've done for her. He did not say anything else in my hearing. The deceased did not struggle. She gasped twice and then died. She was lying on her back. William Sharp then said, I am a brewer in the employment of Mr. Horry. At about 3:15 yesterday afternoon, the last witness, Betsy Wingate, came running to me in the brewhouse and said Master Fred had knocked his wife down and nearly killed her. I went up to the house immediately, and on going into the breakfast room, I saw the deceased lying on the floor in a dying state. She was gasping but could not speak. Her husband was standing at her feet. He held a revolver in his right hand. I said to him, "Oh, Fred, what have you done?" He made no reply to my question, but about 2 minutes afterwards he said, "Go for a policeman and a cab." His mother was crying, and he said, "I know what I've done." He did not appear to be at all concerned. I did not hear him say he wished to shoot anyone else. Thomas Horry, who was deeply affected and gave his evidence with suppressed emotion, said, "The deceased, Jane Horry, was the wife of my brother, William Horry. At about 3:15 yesterday afternoon, I was on the Bargate Bridge. I was told I was wanted at home immediately. I went home and saw the deceased stretched lifeless on the floor of the breakfast room, and my brother standing at her feet, holding a pistol in his right hand. Someone exclaimed, 'Get out of the way, or he'll shoot you,' and I replied, 'He will not do any more harm.' I then asked him to give me the revolver, and he gave it to me at once, and warned me to be careful with it as it was loaded. I said, 'Oh, Fred, what have you done?' He replied, 'It's no use now, Tom. It can't be helped. It's done.' I am aware that he had been extremely jealous of his wife. It amounted almost to frenzy at times. The pistol produced by Superintendent Waghorn is the one I received from my brother." Thomas Kell said, "I am inspector at the Great Northern Railway Station at Nottingham. I have been acquainted with Mr. Horry's family for the last 5 years. I saw Mr. Frederick Horry on Saturday afternoon last. He came up to our station at Nottingham just before the starting of the 6 p.m. train. I observed nothing strange in his manner. He took a ticket for Boston, and I walked with him to the train. He then asked me for a parcel he expected had been sent to meet him there. I signalled the train away and told him I would send the parcel after him. Directly the train had gone, the parcel was brought to me from Mr. Jackson, the gunmaker of Church Street in Nottingham. The shape of the parcel attracted my attention. I thought it was a pistol. Knowing the unpleasantness which had existed between Horry and his wife, my suspicions were aroused, and my regard for the family induced me to open the parcel. And when I found it contained a revolver and 2 boxes of cartridges, I telegraphed to his father and told him his son was coming to Boston, and in addition to this, I wrote a letter to him informing him he had a pistol in his possession. The young man returned from Grantham by the next train and claimed the parcel. He left it in my possession until Sunday afternoon, when he left for Boston by the 2 o'clock train." Dr. A. Tuxford sworn. "I am a doctor of medicine residing in this town. On Monday last at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I was requested to go and see young Mrs. Horry at Mr. William Horry's, who, it was said, had fallen downstairs. I immediately went and saw a young woman lying dead on the floor of a sitting room. I saw Mrs. Horry and 2 or 3 of the servants. I asked if the deceased had broken her neck, as I could see no external injuries. Someone replied, 'She's been shot.' I asked by whom, and was answered by her husband. I had her removed and examined the body. I found a pistol shot wound between the 5th rib from behind, just under the left shoulder blade. On Tuesday morning, in company with Dr. Clegg, I made a post-mortem examination and found that the bullet, after penetrating through the fifth rib, passed upwards through the lower part of the upper lobe of the left lung and lodged in the aorta, causing excessive hemorrhaging, which was the cause of death. The wound was of a nature to cause death in a few seconds. Up to this point, the evidence showed what William Horry did. What now emerges is the far more troubling question of why. In the aftermath of the shooting, Horry repeatedly insisted that he had been driven to desperation by his wife's supposed infidelity, naming at various times several respectable men within their community. In Victorian England, accusations of this kind were often treated as a motive capable of explaining even the most shocking domestic crimes. A husband's jealousy, if inflamed enough, was frequently described as though it were a force beyond reason. But the difficulty here is that nothing in the surviving record suggests that Horry's suspicions had any basis in fact. His jealousy had long been noted by those around him, jealousy that worsened with drink, and which had already shattered the marriage months before the killing. And so, the case now balances on a crucial question. Were Horry's accusations the tragic truth, or the spiraling delusions of a man undone by alcohol, resentment, and rejection? Francis Glover deposed, I am Sergeant of Police in the Borough of Boston. At about 3:30 on Monday afternoon, accompanied by Superintendent Waghorn, I went to the house of Mr. Horry in Horncastle Road. When we got there, Mr. F.K. Horry was standing in the office. I went to him and charged him with the wilful murder of his wife by shooting her with a revolver. He answered, I did it, and I'm very sorry I have not shot Dr. Oldham, Mr. Tompkinson, and Mr. Pearson, who had connections with my wife. She has always admitted it to me, but she never would admit it to my father. I do love that woman, and she had not only admitted it to my father, I could freely have forgiven her. I should have shot myself, only I wanted the public to know what I have done this for. After then, I shall be soon with her again. On searching him, he asked me to allow him to keep a piece of the deceased's hair, which he had in his hand. I acceded to his request. Thomas Wright, brother to the deceased, then stepped forward and asked to be allowed to make a statement. On being sworn, he said, I am managing clerk to a firm of solicitors at Northampton. I have heard the evidence of the last witness, Sergeant Glover, and I am anxious, for the sake of my sister's memory, to state that the information alleged by him to have been given by Mr. Horry, that my sister, the deceased, had admitted to him that Dr. Oldham, Mr. Pearson, and Mr. Tompkinson had connections with her, is wholly untrue. Some 8 months ago, being 4 months after the separation between my sister and her husband, he, the husband, called upon me at Northampton. My sister was then staying with us, and his object in coming was to obtain an interview with her. I declined to allow that, and in the course of a 2-hour conversation with Mr. Horry, he stated several times that he should not care so much if my sister would only admit to him that these statements were true, but that in spite of evidence which was professed to have been, she persisted in denying it to him. I know that on subsequent occasions the same thing has taken place with other members of my family. 3 days before the home was broken up in Burslem, I went to inquire into these circumstances and, accompanied by my father, saw every witness whose names he would give us, and the result of our inquiries satisfied both his father and myself that there was not a tittle of foundation for the charges he had made against his wife. I make these remarks because I feel that I could not allow the statement to go forth to the world uncontradicted. The jury retired a few moments and on their return delivered the following verdict. From the evidence adduced this evening touching the death of Jane Horry, it is the painful duty of the jury, who are unanimous in their opinion, to say that William F. Horry shot and killed his wife, Jane Horry, on Monday the 15th of January 1872, and that they find a verdict of wilful murder against the said William F. Horry. The prisoner was taken before the magistrates on Tuesday and formally remanded until Thursday, when he was again taken before the bench and further remanded. The jury's decision could hardly have been clearer. Within minutes, they returned with a unanimous verdict of wilful murder, and William Horry was led away to await the next stage of proceedings. What had begun as a domestic tragedy inside the breakfast room of a quiet Boston household was now fully recognized as a capital crime. For the Horry family, already devastated, the verdict carried a terrible double weight: the loss of a beloved daughter-in-law and the knowledge that their own son would now stand trial for her murder. Sympathy in the town lay overwhelmingly with them, with the elderly parents who had done everything possible to protect Jane, and with the 3 young children now left utterly bereft. As Horry was formally remanded and moved through the gears of the Victorian justice system, public interest began to sharpen. Newspapers across Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire seized on every detail: the jealousy, the revolver parcel from Nottingham, the father's heartbreak, and the chilling calm with which Horry had stood over his dying wife. But no one yet understood that this case, tragic as it was, would soon become a turning point in British execution history. For when William Horry faced the gallows, he would do so under an entirely new method, one never before attempted in Britain. Before we reach that moment, however, the evidence would be tested again, this time before a Crown court, with the full weight of Victorian law bearing down. From the Lincolnshire Free Press, the 19th of March, 1872, the wife murder at Boston. The trial of William Frederick Horry for the wilful murder of his wife at Boston caused the greatest excitement in Lincoln, and the court was crowded to suffocation on Wednesday morning. The Honourable John Richard Quain was the presiding judge. The prisoner pleaded not guilty to both charges. The grand jury found a true bill, and the trial was proceeded with on Wednesday morning. Long before the time announced for opening the court, a large crowd had assembled, for which there was some difficulty in passing, and the court was quite crowded before his lordship took his seat on the bench. The prisoner was charged with the wilful murder of Jane Horry, his wife, at Boston on the 15th day of January, 1872. The prisoner was very neatly dressed, where a large cross in place on the ordinary pin in the necktie, and manifested very little emotion throughout the trial, which occupied between 3 and 4 hours. Sergeant O'Brien, in stating the facts of the case to the jury, that they were fully aware of the grave responsibility which attached to them and the serious consequences to which their verdict would lead. The prisoner was charged with having wilfully and deliberately killed her, Jane Horry, and if anything could aggravate the offence imputed to him, it was that she was his wife and the mother of his children. They'd been married for about 5 years and lived in the early part of their married life on affectionate and friendly terms. Sometime last year, unhappy differences arose, which had, he believed, arisen from some groundless feelings of suspicion which would appear had entered the prisoner's mind. He said groundless suspicions because they would hear in the course of the trial that after the separation of the prisoner from his wife, she was taken by the father of the prisoner and her children were cherished and protected, and they found a father in him. The prisoner seemed to have been abandoned to these groundless suspicions and to have forgotten every other duty that belonged to him. From March 1871 to the 15th of January 1872, the day of this tragic event, he and his wife seemed to have lived apart, but he sometimes visited and was received by her. Much of the early trial testimony simply repeated what had already been established at the inquest. The housemaid, Betsy Wingate, again described seeing Horry at the house that morning, hearing the pistol shot shortly before 3 o'clock, and finding Jane collapsing in the passage. Horry stood nearby with the revolver still in his hand, telling his mother, "I've shot her and she's dead." He added once more that jealousy was the cause. She ran for help, summoning the brewer, William Sharp, and then Thomas Horry, the prisoner's brother. The prosecution noted that these details required little commentary. The facts were plain, the sequence swift, and, crucially, there was no provocation of any kind. Under cross-examination, Betsy added only a few further details. Horry had been unusually agitated that morning, asking repeatedly where Jane had gone, which door she had used, and what she was wearing. When told she'd taken a train, he made no further inquiries. After Jane returned at 12:30, Betsy did not see the couple again until the moment of the shooting. As Jane collapsed in the breakfast room doorway, Horry stood close behind her, saying, "Oh, how I love that woman," before bending to kiss her as she lay dying. He showed no grief or panic, only a strange, quiet composure. William Sharp, the family brewer, confirmed the scene much as Betsy had described it. When he hurried in from the brew house, Jane was already in her final gasps on the breakfast room floor, and Horry stood over her in the doorway, revolver hanging loosely at his side. Sharp asked him, "Oh, Fred, what have you done?" but received no reply. For several minutes, Horry said nothing at all, simply staring at his wife before quietly instructing Sharp to fetch a cab and a policeman. Sharp refused to leave immediately, watching instead as Horry knelt beside Jane and kissed her face. Thomas Harry deposed, "I am a farmer living at Boston, and the prisoner is my brother. On Monday the 15th, I saw Betsy Wingate in the afternoon. In consequence of what she said, I went to my father's house. That would be a few minutes past 3. I went into the breakfast room and I saw Jane Horry. She was lying on the floor. She was then dead. The prisoner was standing at the feet of the deceased, and I noticed the revolver in his hand. I asked him to give me it, and he gave it to me. I gave it to Superintendent Waghorn. I said, 'Good God, brother, what have you done?' He said, 'No use, Tom. It's done. and can't be helped. I know that the deceased had been living with my father and mother for about 9 months. In March of the previous year, she had separated from the prisoner and came to live with my father. She lived with him until her death. She had separated from him in March. He continued, I had frequently seen my brother prior to the separation, and I observed a very marked change in him, as though some great unhappiness had taken hold. After purchasing the goodwill of the George Hotel, where his wife had once been a barmaid, he became a very heavy drinker, and soon, some 2 or 3 years before the separation, he suffered more than one attack of delirium tremens, and from that time onwards, even small amounts of drink produced great excitement in him. He often spoke of feeling uneasy about his wife's conduct and mentioned certain names which I recognized. He appeared fixed in his belief, although none of us found any foundation for it. I saw him on the Sunday evening before the tragedy, and again on the morning of the 15th. On both occasions, his manner struck me as peculiar, similar to past times when drink had unsettled him, but to a considerably greater degree. On Sunday evening, he was in a very violent, excitable state, not under any control whatever. With regard to his conversation, his appearance was much wilder than usual. On Monday morning, it was quite the reverse. I saw that morning at about 11:30 he was shaking and twitching at the mouth, quite like the result of having too much drink previously. It appeared to be the reaction of excessive drinking. Mr. Horry more than once complained with great vehemence of my father, and also under the circumstances under which he and the deceased had separated, with his father taking her to his house. His complaints were frequent and violent. He also stated that confessions were made to him that were not made to his father. When my sister-in-law, Mrs. Horry, was lying on the floor, my brother's eyes looked very wild indeed, and he trembled a great deal. He trembled so much that I led him out of the room into the office. I saw him kiss his wife very fondly. He asked me to give him a lock of her hair. I cut some off and I gave it to him. He kissed it too and exclaimed, "Oh, Tom, how I love that woman. You don't know how I love her, but I can't stand this jealousy." Thomas added that the estrangement between his father and brother had been deepened by these unfounded suspicions, Frederick insisting with almost obsessive vehemence that his wife should admit to his father that she had never admitted to anyone. After the shooting, Frederick complained of feeling cold and strange, asking repeatedly for water and refusing brandy, saying, "No, I have been drunk on that for the last 6 weeks." Thomas confirmed that his brother had suffered an earlier attack of delirium tremens about 15 months before leaving the George Hotel, a decline that marked the beginning of his inability to run the business or maintain control of himself. Thomas explained that he had seen his brother on the Sunday evening, shortly after a telegram had warned their father of his arrival. Frederick stood at the foot of the stairs in an agitated state, insisting that he must speak with his wife. Their father met him in the passage, and Thomas could hear the conversation carried on in terms and tones of great excitement. He added that his parents had always treated Jane as their own daughter, and that when the marital troubles first began, his father had personally investigated Frederick's accusations and found them entirely groundless. Thomas noted that the unstable, excitable condition in which he found his brother that night was one they had witnessed many times before. Attempts to assist him were usually rejected. The next morning he learned that Frederick had purchased a pistol in Nottingham over the weekend, and he recognised two of the men whom his brother suspected, both nothing more than ordinary customers at the George Hotel. The prosecution next called evidence proving that Horry had armed himself deliberately before travelling to Boston. A Nottingham gunsmith, Samuel Jackson, stated that Horry purchased the revolver 2 days before the killing, claiming rather improbably that it was intended for a brother emigrating to Australia. Jackson sent the weapon and 100 cartridges to the Great Northern Railway Station as instructed. There, Station Inspector Thomas Kell described how Horry had asked about trains to Boston and collected a ticket for the journey. When the parcel arrived shortly after Horry's departure, Kell recognised its shape as that of a pistol. Knowing of the family troubles and concerned for Mrs. Horry's safety, he opened it, confirming his suspicions, and immediately telegraphed the prisoner's father. Horry returned to Nottingham that same evening, collected the parcel the next day, and boarded the 2 o'clock train to Boston. Kell told the court that on both occasions Horry appeared intoxicated and in a most excited state, leaving little doubt that he had travelled with the weapon fully aware of his intentions. With the evidence complete, Sergeant O'Brien addressed the jury only briefly. Justice, he said, was perfectly safe in their hands. Every great crime has a motive, honourable or otherwise, and in this case the motive was unmistakable. A set of groundless suspicions that the prisoner had allowed to take hold of him until they eclipsed every duty he owed to his wife and children. Yes, Horry believed his wife unfaithful, but in such unproven jealousy, stoked by drink and brooded over in private, it could not excuse murder. Then no household in England would be safe. What had begun as a drunken fantasy had hardened into a conviction that he was determined to avenge. The facts, the sergeant argued, spoke plainly. When the marriage failed and the business collapsed, it was Jane whom the family protected, taking her and the children into the father's home for nearly a year. Every attempt to investigate Horry's accusations had cleared her name, yet the prisoner clung to the delusion. And so, on the Saturday before the murder, he travelled to Nottingham, bought a revolver under a false pretext, and carried it deliberately to Boston. Whatever excitement or trembling he displayed afterwards, he was entirely consistent with a man who had set himself to a terrible task and then accomplished it. He met his wife on Monday with a purpose. O'Brien concluded that he carried that purpose out. The sergeant urged the jury to consider the evidence calmly, fearlessly, and conscientiously, confident that their verdict would follow unmistakably from the facts. The defence. For the defence, Mr. Digby Seymour rose and spoke with a frankness that immediately acknowledged the gravity of the charge. He told the jury that he stood not merely to plead for the prisoner, but more poignantly for 3 small children who had already lost their mother and who now faced the prospect of losing their father as well. He accepted that the evidence against Horry was substantial. The real question, he argued, was whether the jury could see in this tragedy any grounds for mercy, whether this was truly the work of a cool, deliberate murderer, or the final collapse of a young man already overwhelmed by jealousy, drink, and despair. Seymour asked the jury to consider the life of Horry had once imagined: a respectable marriage, a thriving business at the George Hotel in Burslem, and a stable future built on a family support. But the woman he married had previously worked as a barmaid, and in the course of her duties she naturally became acquainted with acquaintances that in Horry's troubled mind began to take on darker meaning. By early 1871, suspicions, whether grounded or not, had crept into the marriage. Domestic life fractured. The hotel was given up. Horry's wife and children found refuge not with her own family, but with his, taken in, protected, and cherished by the prisoner's father. To Horry, Seymour argued, this only deepened the wound. The collapse of his home life had left him stripped of a wife, children, business, affection, and the comforts of his childhood home. Alone, unwelcome, and sinking into excessive drinking, Horry's mental state declined sharply. His brother had already described previous bouts of delirium tremens, and it was therefore unsurprising, Seymour said, that when Horry purchased the revolver, witnesses observed him excited, distressed, and plainly affected by drink. There had even been talk of a divorce case. Solicitors and counsel consulted, papers drawn up, yet the tragedy unfolded before any resolution could be reached. Seymour did not deny the horror of the act, but he urged the jury to look upon the prisoner as a man whose reason had been slowly eroded, whose jealousy had grown into fixation, and whose despair had driven him to an act, although terrible, was not the cold, calculated murder suggested by the prosecution. If there was a space within the law for mercy, he asked them to find it. His lordship said the position of the prisoner was a very painful one, but he was bound to tell the jury that it was their duty to vindicate the law and protect society from crimes of this sort. They were bound to find the prisoner guilty or not guilty of murder. There was no evidence to reduce this charge to manslaughter, and they must not, as a jury, be led away by the touching and powerful appeal that had been made to them. He stated, "It is my duty to tell you, but this is not a case of insanity which excuses crime, whether the jealousy was just or unjust. Drunkenness is no excuse for murder." Verdict. The jury retired for about 1/4 of an hour and returned into court with a verdict of guilty. The prisoner did not speak when asked by the clerk of arraigns whether he had anything to say why sentence should not be carried out. With the verdict returned and the sentence of death formally passed, Horry's furious certainty seemed to collapse into something far quieter. In the days that followed, he became notably subdued, expressing regret, reading scripture, and refusing even to contemplate an appeal. The law had spoken. He appeared resigned to its course. But while Horry prepared himself spiritually, the authorities faced a far more practical problem. Who was going to hang him? Lincolnshire had not forgotten its last execution, the 1868 hanging of Priscilla Biggersdyke, a grim spectacle, performed by Thomas Askin under the old short drop method favoured by William Calcraft. Calcraft's approach, widely criticised even in his own day, often produced prolonged struggling and slow strangulation. Biggersdyke's death had been exactly such an ordeal, and the memory still hung heavily over the county officials. With Horry's execution now fixed for 9 a.m. on the 1st of April, neither the sheriff nor Governor Foster had any desire to preside over another catastrophe. At this moment in history, local authorities still possessed the right to choose their own hangman. The Home Office had not yet standardised the profession or created the later official list. So Lincolnshire was left to find quickly someone competent, sober, and ideally not another Calcraft. The solution came from an unsuspected quarter, a quiet, methodical shoemaker from Horncastle who insisted he had devised a more humane, more reliable method of execution, and after some persuasion, the officials agreed to give him a chance. His name was William Marwood, and with Horry's death, he was about to demonstrate a technique that would transform British executions for the next century. The old method versus Marwood's new science of hanging. Before 1872, almost every execution in England, whether carried out by Calcraft in London or by a provincial hangman like Thomas Askern, used the short drop method. It was simple, traditional, and by Victorian standards, completely acceptable. By modern standards, however, it was not humane. Under the short drop, the condemned man stood on a ladder or platform that was pulled away, leaving them to die slowly of strangulation. The fall was too small to break the neck, so death could take many minutes. Calcraft himself was known for sometimes pulling on a prisoner's legs to speed things along, sometimes gleefully and theatrically, swinging on the prisoner's legs, a detail the press never forgot. By the late 1860s, however, attitudes were shifting. The spectacle of public execution had ended, and there was growing pressure, partly moral, partly practical, to make the process quicker, quieter, and above all, more controlled. Into that discussion stepped William Marwood, a shoemaker from Horncastle, with a surprisingly analytical mind. Marwood believed that a hanging should be precise, predictable, and instantaneous. His solution was the long drop method, a calculated fall based on the prisoner's height and weight, long enough to break the neck cleanly and cause near instant unconsciousness. It was, in intention and often in practice, a more scientific and less traumatic form of execution. When William Horry's case reached Lincolnshire's authorities, they still remembered the distressing Biggersdyke execution of 1868 under the old method. With the new long drop theory beginning to circulate, and Marwood himself volunteering his services, officials saw a chance to change course. Horry would become the first person in Britain to die by Marwood's method. The execution of William Horry. With no appeal lodged by Horry's team, and by all accounts believing his sentence just, William Horry spent his final hours in prayer and reflection. He wrote a contrite farewell letter and received the sacrament from the prison chaplain, the Reverend Richter, who would remain at his side, reciting the special burial service reserved for executions. A few minutes before 9 o'clock, executioner William Marwood entered the condemned cell and quietly pinioned Horry's arms. Then, accompanied by two warders, Governor Foster, Chaplain Richter, and the prison surgeon, the small procession made the short walk across the castle yard to the new gallows constructed at Lincoln Castle, a stark, purpose-built structure modelled on new gates, new drop. Horry walked steadily, needing no support. At the foot of the steps he turned to Governor Foster and said softly, Goodbye, Mr. Foster. God bless you. God forgive my poor dear father, and God bless my poor children. On the scaffold, Marwood worked with calm efficiency. He strapped Horry's ankles, drew the white hood over his head, and positioned the noose precisely beneath the left ear, the key to ensuring the long drop would achieve instantaneous unconsciousness. As he stood on the trap, Horry spoke only one final sentence, echoing the judge who had condemned him. Lord, have mercy on my soul. Governor Foster gave a small nod, and Marwood pulled the lever. The trap fell cleanly, a sharp crack, described by witnesses as like a dry branch snapping, signalling that the long drop had done exactly what Marwood intended. There was no struggle, no lingering. The prison surgeon confirmed that death had been effectively instantaneous, with no indication of suffering. In that moment, Marwood's once theoretical method became proven fact. The execution of William Horry marked not only the end of a tragic domestic story, but the beginning of a new, profoundly influential chapter in British execution practice. The murder of Jane Horry was a quiet domestic tragedy, the kind that played out all too often in Victorian England, where drink, jealousy, and desperation could combust in a single irreversible moment. Yet what followed placed this case on a very different footing. In the space of a few minutes on a cold April morning, the execution of William Horry marked the point at which Britain decisively stepped away from centuries of clumsy, agonising hangings and into a new, scientific era of state punishment. Marwood's long drop was not introduced out of kindness, but out of a growing national discomfort with the spectacle of suffering on the gallows, and in demonstrating for the first time that a precisely measured fall could bring a swifter, more certain death. The horror execution effectively modernised British capital punishment. Within months, sheriffs across the country were requesting Marwood by name, and within years, the method became standard procedure. It's a cruel irony that such a transformation began with a family already broken beyond repair, a young mother killed, 3 children orphaned, and a respected local household plunged into grief. Yet from this deeply personal disaster emerged one of the most significant shifts in Victorian criminal justice. The Horry case stands at that awkward intersection between private misery and public reform. It reminds us how often change arrives not through committees or grand debate, but through the unbearable consequence of a single moment. And it marks unmistakably the day Britain's gallows stepped into the modern age. Further particulars. And now, as ever, we turn to further particulars, that cherished corner of Victorian life where decorum went to die, usually in the company of someone making a great fuss about absolutely nothing. Today's instalment comes from Cambridge, where a particularly delicate-stomached publican had declared that he will no longer serve lady cyclists wearing rational dress, a garment so scandalous, so civilization-threatening, that it apparently caused his other patrons to lose the will to sip their ale in peace. Victorian outrage being what it was, naturally the solution was not to calm down, but to ban the trousers. Let us observe, then, a nation grappling with a moral panic brought on by women in knickerbockers, and a publican convinced he is defending the last bastion of British propriety, one coffee room at a time. From the Cambridge Independent Press, the 20th of May, 1898. A publican is not usually thought to be a man of very delicate sensibilities in the matter of taste. But we read with considerable amusement of one who has intimated that he will henceforth serve no more lady cyclists in rational dress in his coffee room. He says that he has been driven to take this step because his other guests object to their presence. A publican has right to exclude from his premises all persons whose presences might be reasonably objectionable to other guests. And so, if the woman in knickerbockers acts so powerfully upon the minds of the frequenters of the end, she will have to stay outside and quench her thirst at the village pump or the wayside stream, which is much better for her more than potent liquor. If the wearing of rational dress keeps women out of public houses, there may be something to be said for its adoption, but the action of the publican is more likely, I suspect, to kill its last chance of popularity. Well, that really is the end. Yes, you in the back, the one quietly dozing behind the metaphorical potted plant. It's time to gather your belongings, check under the seat for any emotional support biscuits, and vacate the premises in an orderly Victorian fashion. No need to form a queue. We don't have the staffing for it. Before you dash off, a tiny request from the archives. If you've enjoyed today's story, do pop in a like on the video, subscribe, and you ring the little bell. It helps the algorithm recognize that you are indeed a person of impeccable historical taste. Patreon, paid membership, what you actually get. We've had a surprising number of free members recently, and we do adore you all. But just so there's no confusion, a paid membership, a very modest £5 a month, unlocks everything. And by everything, we mean the entire News of the Times archive of 850 plus episodes, Victorian, Edwardian, Georgian, folkloric, all of it. 6 uploads a week exclusive to Patreon across our full universe. All historical deep dives, including cases not shown on YouTube. All Robin & Co. written episodes. Exclusive series such as Mysterious Britain, The Victorian Parlour, and Historical Scandals. Early access to every News of the Times episode. All chronicles of curious conduct pieces. A peaceful, advert-free environment for listening. If you've been enjoying the research and storytelling here on YouTube, Patreon is where the entire library lives. You're warmly invited to join us. Paid membership keeps the kettle on, the archives open, and the cases coming. Patreon.com/News of the Times Historical Crime. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, part-time consultant in Victorian gallows engineering, amateur ferret diplomat, and chairman of the Society for Misplaced Paraphernalia. And finally, whoever left the postman in the linen cupboard again, please do let the poor man out. He's begun alphabetizing the towel rolls, and frankly we haven't the heart to stop him. Until next time, stay warm, stay curious, and beware of any appliance that develops a personality.